Hello everyone. Today the topic of our presentation is Digital Storytelling with Refugee Learners in Formal and Non-Formal Settings, a Comparative Spatial Analysis. To start off our presentation, we wanted to share the broader context within which we situate our work. There is a growing trend of refugee resettlement in Western states, and comparative educators are considering how increased people and knowledge flows across nations will require diverse learning perspectives and alternative ways of knowing. One of comparative education's continuing priorities will be to create learning spaces that are beyond the human. That is, those that adopt multimodal educational approaches and consider refugee learners' diversity along factors such as culture, language, ethnicity, and transnationality. These contextual considerations form the basis of our presentation. In this presentation, we are focusing on one innovative educational activity, digital storytelling, and its use with refugee learners. Using a spatial theory lens, our objective in this analysis is to engage in a comparative analysis of how digital storytelling educational spaces may be developed in two distinct settings, formal and non-formal settings, to foster refugees' learning and informing educators working in this area. Before getting into the deeper elements of our work, we wanted to clarify some key terms we are using throughout our presentation. The first is the difference between formal and non-formal education settings. Formal education settings are institution-based settings using a structured curriculum like a school or a university. They are typically designed around chronological age-based trajectories and rely on formal assessment criteria. For refugee learners in Canada, they can take the shape of English language and literacy classrooms, school-based counseling, partial settlement services, and sometimes trauma-informed curriculum and learning activities. Non-formal education settings, on the other hand, operate outside the formal school system. These include initiatives such as community organizations, nonprofits, and grassroots groups. These are typically short-term, voluntary, and non-credential-based programs or initiatives. They are complementary or supplementary to institutional schooling. These can include activities such as individual and social development, job and career development, skills or competency development. In Canada, non-formal education for refugee learners may include initiatives such as individual capacity development, skills and employment training, and language classes. To clarify what digital storytelling is, it's an activity-based educational tool which can be seen as a technological version of storytelling. Learners ultimately create a short movie clip using audio, video, and photographs to showcase a personal story or experience. Learners are using static or moving images that are displayed with a voice-over narration explaining the story and significance of their images. Overall, it facilitates skills and literacy building, such as basic technology, new media tools, creative writing, and digital ethics. And it can also facilitate socio-technological, self-directed, and transformational learning. To touch on our conceptual framework, we relied on a spatial theory framework to guide our ongoing analysis. To address the question of why a spatial optic is useful to understand digital storytelling with refugee learners, it's important to broadly conceptualize any educational space as a social production. Spaces are situated in a network of social relations, including social activity, knowledge construction, discourses, policies, and practices. For an educator, it is now necessary to consider the ongoing social relations that are being created, negotiated, and resisted, not only between learners, but also between learners and their environment. A spatial lens also sees a natural fit in understanding refugee learner needs. In today's global reality, comparative researchers will need to engage in critical spatial theorizing and research to fully understand the relationality of place and space, or the local and global. Comparative spatial research, specifically with refugees, is one concrete way to study this relationality. That's because refugees can be seen as embodying the local and global simultaneously. They are the carriers of multispatial knowledges, learnings, and skills, which are acquired through their intersectional experiences of mobility and migration, dislocation, marginalization, trauma, survival, and resilience. In terms of our modes of inquiry were inspired by Henri Lefebvre and his spatial analysis framework, through which we explored how formal and non-formal digital storytelling spaces with refugees may be constructed by its participants. We specifically relied on secondary data analysis, in which we engaged in a close reading of key documents which provided detailed analyses about the development, implementation, and outcomes of digital storytelling projects in formal and non-formal settings. In terms of our data sources, the Lefebvrean approach to spatial triad analysis involves the selection and analysis of multiple types of data to uncover the conceived, perceived, and lived spaces of any setting. We only focused on analyzing each digital storytelling project's conceived and lived spatial production for illustration purposes. To give a sense of how Lefebvre defines these terms, a conceived space is the intended or imagined space as produced by educators, and a lived space, on the other hand, is the experienced, felt, negotiated, and or countered space, and the one that might be resisted, as produced by learners. Our secondary data sources for an ongoing document analysis include empirical studies or project reports, which are detailing the planning and learner outcomes of digital storytelling projects with refugee learners in formal and non-formal settings. And in these studies and reports, we are analyzing how these spaces were distinctly constructed and transformed by educators and learners. So what are we finding? Our findings from our review of secondary data sources indicates two core themes. The first theme is that formal and non-formal settings are distinct conceived and lived spaces. In terms of the conceived space, in formal digital storytelling projects, educators conceptualize the space as one that is based on predefined goals and curriculum that has to be aligned with institutional priorities. Digital storytelling projects are conceived as conveying core academic skills over creative and self-expressive ones. On the other hand, informal digital storytelling projects that are lived through by the participants, these are actively negotiated and resisted. Refugee learners frequently wrestled with the rigid features of the software and technology, and they used image-based media specifically to negotiate and resist the curriculum's grammar and pronunciation benchmarks. For non-formal digital storytelling projects, the spaces were conceived by educators as more responsive to refugees' social realities. For example, one project focused on the increased refugee migration in Europe and contextualized the project based on this theme. Non-formal digital storytelling projects were also conceived by educators as a space which served as a metaphoric bridge between the nation-state citizens and the refugee population that was frequently othered in society. For non-formal digital storytelling projects, these spaces were lived through by the participants as based on their lived worlds. Participants produced the space as a hybrid, based on their physical and virtual spatial identities, and frequently created digital stories that represented their social relations, learnings, and identities which were multi-layered and which transcended time and space. In terms of our second theme, we found that formal and non-formal settings are spaces that are uniquely produced by its main developers, that is, the educators, and its learners, that is, the refugee participants. In both settings, effective educator roles were those that focused more on supporting refugee learners in their quest to resist and change perceptions of their conceived otherhood in society, and fostering collaboration for them to create a collective community. In these spaces, educator roles that were more effective were those that were backgrounded, more facilitative, were more supportive, and focused more on guidance. In both settings, refugee participants take on an active role to transform the digital storytelling learning space into a vibrant and alternative postmodern entity. They bridge their global and local identities and learnings through their digital stories. The focus is more on content creation, creativity, and self-expression. So in terms of the contribution to the field, the contribution of our findings based on close reading of empirical studies and reports on digital storytelling projects and our ongoing analysis of data, as we mentioned in the beginning of our presentation, complements the existing knowledge base about refugee learning in the comparative education field. Our analysis raises new areas of comparative inquiry, which wrangle with how to develop creative digital education approaches which consider refugee learners' lives across time and space in a hyper-globalized world. We use this analysis to argue for the importance of non-formal education spaces in supporting refugees' resettlement through creative and multimodal technological activities. Refugee education in non-formal settings can facilitate the comparative education field to promote social change by reading the global, understanding transitologies, comprehending the other, and analyzing pedagogies. Future comparative education research requires analyzing how global realities are manifested in local spaces. Non-formal spaces appear to be a useful entry point to explore this recommendation. And with that, we'd like to conclude our presentation. Thank you.